Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. So what is power? Is it being recognized by others? Is it earning it because of your hard work? Or did you inherit power because of your education or your wealth? Well, today on Inner Compass, our guest has interviewed hundreds of prominent leaders and has ideas of what makes them tick and how they got their power. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Michael Lindsay of Rice University's Department of Sociology and their Center on Race, Religion, and Urban Life. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
So, what makes powerful people tick is a very interesting topic, and you're doing the research on it. And you're not just doing the survey, but you're interviewing powerful people. Tell me about that. What's this like?
Yeah, well, what we decided to do is trying to go visit folks who are in powerful positions and hear their stories, and then try and make sense of it. So we ask the same basic kind of questions of hundreds of different leaders in business and politics and nonprofit life, and trying to understand their networks, the things that they're involved in, their upbringing, their family background, and what motivates them, what makes them tick and get them excited about the positions that they hold.
So do you put your Rolodex in a safe at night? It's because everybody's phone number is right there, accessible. I mean, how did you get their phone numbers? What do you do, call them up?
No, yeah, that's amazing. Good question, because a lot of times it's tough to get access to folks. It's interesting because the way in which I do my studies is I interview folks who are in leadership positions at the current moment, or if they've held leadership positions. And it's actually the latter category, people who have been in power but then moved on, they're the toughest to reach. It's like they fall off the face of the earth. You can't get access to them.
They don't have a press secretary, or they don't have a social person who's keeping their calendar?
That's right. And so oftentimes the email address that they have is their personal email address, their phone number is their home phone number. So it can be a little bit challenging. But I found when doing interviews, it pays to be persistent and to keep at it and to drop as many names as possible.
Yeah, because why trust you? I mean, so many people interview powerful people, use it for their own advantage, and then slant it in a way that they say, oh, I'm never going to talk to a person again. So why do they trust you?
Well, I think because I use a lot of personal connections to get access, and that's worked very well. And then I also have a method that I call critical empathy, which is that I want to bring all of the tools of social science, so I do an objective, critical analysis, but I'm empathetic. I try to tell people stories in a way that they recognize themselves, and at the end they can say, well, I'm not sure if I liked exactly what the guy said, but I think he told the story fairly and objectively, and that's our goal.
When you make your list of powerful people, how do you decide how did they get on the list?
I do what's called a positional analysis. So you get to be, in my studies, you get to be included in the interviews if you occupied a senior position over a major American institution. So for example, in government, I don't interview mayors and governors, but I interview members of Congress, cabinet secretaries, and a few former presidents. So I'm looking at the really top strata of the powerful few, and if you had that position, then you're counted in my study.
And how much of the information is confidential? So if I asked you, what was the tidbit that you learned from one of these important people, what would you tell us on the air?
Yeah, I can tell you most things. Folks did have the option of answering a couple of questions off the record, and they would do that. And they also had the chance to review the transcript. So unlike, let's say, a journalistic account, I'm really trying to tell the story as accurately as possible. So the individuals that I interview, they get a chance to review the transcript, to edit their comments, and they can give me feedback on the process. About 10% of the people actually do that.
Okay. So when you have interviewed these folks, then does it sort of like a rabbit trail, then it gives you other people to think about and then other people to think about, and they help you enter into those conversations with those other famous or notorious people?
Yeah, it works that way. So for example, I got the interview with President Carter, and he was one of the early persons who gave me an interview, which I was very grateful for. I got the interview because a guy that I went to college with, his dad was very good friends with President Carter. So when I started out trying to do interviews, I called him up and said, Dr. Vestal, can you help me get to an interview with President Carter? And in the end, that worked out very well. After I interviewed President Carter, I said, are there other folks that I ought to interview? And he said, well, I think you ought to go talk to other former presidents. So I used that when I approached other former presidents, and former President Bush, who gave me an interview, said, you know, I think it helped that you had interviewed President Carter, and he thought that it would be helpful for you to get different perspectives. So I dropped people's names left and right. And
honestly?
Yeah, honestly. If somebody said that they recommend I go talk to somebody, then I tried to do it. And I think it also helped that I was willing to wait. Sometimes I had to wait a full year to get an interview with somebody, but I was willing to travel anywhere and to do any kind of thing. One of my favorite interviews is I interviewed Secretary of Commerce Don Evans, and we actually did the interview at Washington Reagan Airport. I met him at the curbside, and we walked through the entire airport while I had the tape recorder. Literally, we walked through security to do the interview. I had to get a special ticket to be able to go through security because I wasn't flying out that day. So you never know.
It takes.
Whatever it takes.
So do people in power want to share their stories in order for other people in power to be better at it, or to have the ordinary person be inspired to power?
I think I'm naturally curious about people, and I want to hear their stories, and I think that comes out when I sit down with folks. And over time, you just build up a rapport. I wouldn't say that necessarily the people I interviewed have a grand vision of trying to get their story out there, but I think that it's refreshing for them. Many of them deal with the media all the time, but I wasn't looking for a 15-second soundbite. I was looking for an hour sit-down conversation. And I tried to tell those stories in what I write in all of its complexity and nuance, and that really resonated.
So what do you hope to accomplish by this research?
Well, it's obvious to me, you cannot prepare the next generation of leaders if we don't know what makes the current cohort of leaders tick. And there really hasn't been a lot of serious academic study given to top leaders. So my goal is to revitalize that field of intellectual inquiry, which was very strong in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and to help us make a better educated, informed decision about what actually prepares people for powerful positions.
So my observations of people in power, whether it's locally or globally, is that there are inspirational aspects to themselves, excellent characters, but then there's also feet of clay. Yeah. And when you interviewed people, did you see the mixture of this sort of feet of clay, ordinary, maybe mistake, compromised person, along with the person who was eager to serve or eager to make a difference and be significant?
Yeah, there's a lot of complex interplay of motivations, and sometimes our best ambitions we don't actually achieve, and reality sets in. Probably the best example of this is I went to go do an interview with the CEO of a Fortune 50 company, and he said, let's meet for lunch at the Four Seasons. I thought, well, that sounds pretty good. So we get there. He's an hour late for the interview, and when we get there, he said, you need to order the tortilla soup and all this stuff. And then the bill comes. And I thought, well, for sure, he was going to pick it up because I knew from my research he had made $23 million the last year.
Well,
and
he could afford lunch.
He could afford lunch. I made $16,000 as a grad student that year. And you know what? He stuck me with the bill.
Oh, my goodness.
Turned out he was one of the stingiest executives around. And
so he wanted a good meal, and he figured, look, he was giving you his time?
I think that's right. And
so
I think also sometimes, you rise up to a position in society and you actually forget that there are folks for whom a $140 lunch would actually be a real stretch.
I can imagine. Yeah. So there's a character issue there and a self-importance.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So what do you find in terms of the people that you've been interviewing? Are they serving because they want to be a servant leader, or are they serving because they have an ego or a narcissism or a grandiose idea that they could save the world?
It's interesting. 35% of the leaders that I interviewed said that ambition is actually a deep moral, even spiritual struggle in their life. They say, I feel, in a sense, called to doing the kind of work I'm doing, and I've been given talents and abilities, and I'm excited about it, and at the same time I have to push and move forward, and I wonder if maybe I'm pushing too hard. So that ambition creeps in time and again, not just in politics, but in all sectors of society.
But don't you think ambition for the right reasons is a noble thing? Most people don't want to pick up the problems of others. These are great, big, messy, complex things, and look, I can lead an easier life. I don't need to be a leader. I don't need to have the headaches and the burdens of leadership. So it has to have a motivation that is beyond just ordinary living life. You have to have some ambition to want greater things.
Yeah, that's right. What I found is that the most impressive people were ambitious not for their their own attention, but for their organization's goals. So that they were very proud of the company they worked for, they were very proud of their team, and they were very much promoters of the work that they were doing. But it was not what they had individually done, but instead what the group had done. Probably a great example of this is Ken Starr. I have to say, I went in to interview Judge Starr, and
he did the Watergate investigation.
Yeah, the Whitewater investigation.
Whitewater, right.
And my whole impression of him was formed by sort of the media. And
they did not have a great impression of him. They really slammed him quite a bit.
That's
being
right.
rigid and a stickler. And
that's right. And the interesting thing is that here's a guy who was appreciated by both sides of the political aisle. He had served as Solicitor General for the United States. By all accounts, had he not taken the Whitewater job, he'd be on the Supreme Court today. He had that kind of a pedigree and that respectability. So I go out to interview him. He's now dean of the law school at Pepperdine. And I thought, you know, this is not going to be somebody that I really like very much. He was the most self-effacing, humble person. And yet he was very, very proud of the work he'd done throughout his life, including the Whitewater Project. And so he was disarming. In many ways, I had walked in with an expectation, and he turned out to be one of the most winsome persons I interviewed.
Well, Ken Starr was picked because people trusted his integrity. They would know he would not be sucked into the political process. But the media then took this leader, took this person of power, and cast him as a person who was very partisan. And so he really gave up his future opportunities for service to the country. And what do you think his motivations for that were?
I asked him about this, and Judge Starr said, you know, I really felt like that what I was doing was the right thing, that I wanted to try and serve. He said, I expected I would work for 2 months, and then I was going to be done, and it turned into 4 years. So I don't think he had any expectations for glory or attention or media exposure. Instead, I think he was genuinely trying to serve in a way that he thought could maybe be helpful for the country. The challenge is that the way our media works, you have to get into very short sound bites, and it lends itself to creating cardboard characters, to where we have to have a hero and we have to have a villain. And the nice thing is that there are outlets like PBS that can create more complex and nuance, but unfortunately we just don't have enough of that going on these days.
My experience is that anytime I hear a story or read something in the newspaper, I think, okay, I've gotten the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot more that maybe can't be said, or they don't want to report on because it would just be boring if you actually knew all the facts.
That's right. Yeah, the leader's life is much more glamorous when you're only looking at the highlights.
Right.
But when you see the day-to-day, that they're going in at 5 a.m., that they're working these long hours, and that much of what they do doesn't have a lot of glitz and glamour, but a lot of hard work. That's one of the things I try to do in my research, is to get sort of into the stories of these people. I have to say, one of the things that I learned is that people who serve, let's say, in government are among the most underappreciated. They work incredibly long hours. The toll it takes on their families, it's extraordinary. And so what we want to try and do is to help demystify that for readers, so they get a better sense of the work that I do, and also the sense of how these leaders have risen up and the hard challenges that will face the next generation.
So how do these people get the power they get? Is it their parenting? You know, is it how they were raised, their upbringing? Was it the schools they went to? You know, I think that there has to be a motivator from early on, or some kind of event that challenged them to do something extraordinary.
There are a couple of factors that make a really key difference. Going to a highly selective school puts you on a certain trajectory. So a third of the people I interviewed attended one of the most selective schools in this country.
Are you talking about college?
Yeah, I'm really speaking about university, either for undergrad or for graduate. So they went, you know, plurality went to Harvard for either undergrad or for one of the graduate degrees. And that helps to have that kind of exposure. But actually, early career opportunities, I think, are the real key. So having a mentor who takes an interest in you, that gives you a good opportunity, serving alongside someone who's in a powerful position, or making those connections early on, we pretty much get tracked within the first 3 to 5 years of our career. And so if you've got someone who's sort of helping nurture you along in that process, it makes a key difference.
And so you might have to do things that you'd say, well, that's not my best paying job right out of college, but it will give you great experience or great networking capabilities.
That's right. I tell all of my students that if you really aspire to national leadership, you have to move to one of the centers of power. So you've got to spend a season of your life in New York or LA or Washington. That's where things happen, and you'll find that you rub shoulders with people that give you some really important opportunities.
So volunteering for a political campaign or a governor's campaign or a senator's campaign, those sorts of things, working in Washington during a semester, those all things make a difference. So if you haven't gone to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, one of those Ivies, you said only a third.
Yeah, that's right. 2/3 did not.
Right, and they have also made a mark.
That's right.
But what have they done?
They found ways to take advantage of the networks that are out there. The way you move up to powerful positions in this country is there's a highway, and you have to get the on-ramp. And early career opportunities are one of the critical roles. Also competitive fellowships. There's a number of fellowships that are out there that, not just the Rhodes Scholarship, but the White House Fellowship, for example. I think probably one that gets underappreciated is the Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship, which is, in my opinion, the most generous and frankly the least selective of the really competitive fellowships, where you go and study abroad for a year after you've graduated college. Those kinds of opportunities really do put you on a upward mobility to move into the higher circles.
So how much does wealth make a difference? So if we say to students or to young professionals, look, just forget about the salary or the income and volunteer. Well, you have to have the ability to pay the bills. How do you get your rent paid? How do you get food on the table? So how does wealth enter into this discussion?
Family wealth makes a difference, but actually not nearly as much as it did 50 years ago. So that young people figure out ways to pay the bills, but at the same time get some important opportunities. And the great thing is that there are a number of different programs that sort of help young and aspiring leaders to move up in the world. And so you got to get connected with those, whether it be at the Aspen Institute or a variety of different networks that are out there, young leadership opportunities. Those are really the key things to take advantage of.
Now, personality. You can have all the networks, you can go to the right schools, and if you're a dud, you know, if you can't talk to people or make people feel comfortable or even know how to access you just don't move ahead. So how much does personality, and I suppose you don't want to have too much personality or not enough. What have you?
Interpersonal grace is really important, so the ability to sort of interact with folks. And there's a real fine line of knowing how to interact with authority figures, because you've got to be able to be deferential and respectful, but you also have to be able to stand up for yourself. And
be interesting.
That's right. Be somebody that they want to talk to in the 30-second elevator ride that you're making with them. So I think that has made an important difference. But, you know, I actually found that personality was not as important as much as it was expertise in a particular domain. So that, for example, there are a whole range of folks who are computer scientists who say, you know, I don't necessarily see myself as a salesman. I don't have that kind of personality. But because they're able to do something that's special or unique, it makes an important difference. Just to give you one example, I interviewed a guy who's now a venture capitalist. How did he sort of move into that at age 40? Well, he'd gone to business school at the University of Chicago and studied with one of the world's leading currency experts. It just so happened that this guy graduated with his MBA around the time that the former Soviet Union was breaking up, and he was involved in a team that was helping create national currencies for these former Soviet republics. So being in the right place at the right time and taking advantage of the moments that are out there, that really is the key difference.
So taking some risks would be important. And also, I've always found that if you can anticipate the needs of someone else, or if you can say, if I did a little bit harder work, maybe I could get that done for that person. You'd say, what do they need to get done? And that actually helps you form some bonds with a mentor or with someone else who could then say, hey, I'm going to help this young person along. If I speak on behalf of this young person, they will not disappoint the person I'm referring them to.
That's right.
And that's critical.
Yes, exactly. You know, the thing that I was most struck by, there was a university president who I interviewed, and he actually makes it a habit of sort of seeking out people that he can try and help along the way, taking the initiative. And he started doing that as a 20-year-old. I think if we sort of get that habit of saying, how can I be helpful and useful to the people around me, and not wait for them to ask me, but actually take the initiative, that makes a really key difference. I found that among folks, for example, who moved up in Hollywood. It was that initiative that really helped them.
So power has a two-edged sword. It's on the one hand, access to all sorts of things that you wouldn't have if you weren't powerful. But there is also a burden that goes along with power. And did the powerful people you talk to tell you about the weight of that and how it maybe shifted during their time in power?
Yeah. Power is an accelerator of good things and bad things. And about a third of the people that I interviewed at some point in time in the conversation would actually cry. And I tried to figure out what was it, because I wasn't trying to draw out these tears. And it was interesting because there was one question that I asked that tended to cause people to be more introspective. I simply asked, has your rise to power ever cost you anything personally?
Right.
And then they would tell stories about broken relationships and failed marriages and the challenges that they faced when they were on the way up and when they were actually in those positions of power. So it comes at great cost at times. The key thing actually I found that sort of keeps leaders doing the right thing over the long haul is having a group of friends who can hold them accountable, ask them the hard questions, and keep their feet to the ground.
So for the people that you interviewed, had they earned their power, or did they think they came by it in a way through family history or illegitimately?
Everybody thought they earned it.
Okay,
everybody
it's hard work.
That's right. And even if they had advantages, even if they came from privileged backgrounds, they all felt like that they had in one way or another cut their teeth and that they had to prove their mettle. And so we believe in the sense of Horatio Alger. Even if you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, we still believe that we have to rise up. Now, what I try to do in my research, and whether it be in Faith in the Halls of Power or other works, is to basically tell the story of the good and the bad, and where people think that they've done it all themselves, when in fact it's been a much wider community that supported and nourished them along the way.
So you tried to shine a light on that their self-perception was like, hey, boy, I just did everything myself, I worked hard. And you'd say, wait a minute, there were some other factors.
Yeah, my favorite thing would be to pull out a speech that they had given or something they had written and say, now, you give the impression that you sort of did it on your own, but clearly your folks played a big role, and the people who gave you your first job, tell me about those individuals. And then that would actually cause them to think, and they could tell some eloquent stories about the difference that other people who had, as you said, brought them along and helped them in their rise to power.
Do you think that they ever really understood that a lot of the common people look at leaders and powerful people and say, oh, you got that just because you came from a particular family or he had the great education. You took it. You didn't earn it. Are they aware that sometimes there's a misperception, or at least a perception at odds with their own self-perception?
Some of the leaders were, and I would say that those were the folks who were most in touch with reality. But there is a way in which information doesn't travel up to the higher circles a lot of times, and so some of the most powerful people don't even realize sort of what other folks who don't run in their same circles are thinking and how they feel about them.
So powerful people can get isolated, can't they?
Yeah.
And what are the dangers? Did they have self-awareness about the dangers of isolation?
No.
Oh.
That was one of the things that struck me, is that many of the leaders that I interviewed sort of exist in gated communities all of their life, that they don't recognize that they feel isolated, but they don't realize that also is, in many ways, they've withdrawn and don't have those kind of relationships. So one of the things that I give advice to my students who want to rise up is to find places where you can hang out with people of all different backgrounds, whether that be social groups or working out at a gym or being involved in a church or community group. That's where you actually will interact with people and be able to keep things real.
Did you interview any individuals who were persons of faith and powerful individuals who at all felt a conflict between should I be grabbing power, exercising power, and what does the Bible say about the exercise of power?
Yeah, a lot of people that I interviewed actually, particularly in politics, because politics is all about self-promotion, and you have to sort of advance yourself. So President Carter talked deeply about how he wasn't sure if actually the way he ought to acquire political power was in that way, and he felt he was satisfied with how he had done it, but he said it was a constant wrestling. On the other side of the political aisle, I interviewed Asa Hutchinson, who had been a congressman, and at the time he was serving as Deputy Secretary for Homeland Security. And as I interviewed him, I said, how do you reconcile sort of the notion in the Bible about how power tends not to be among those who have people of faith, and you are a person of faith. How do you reconcile those? And he said, it's an ongoing tension. I constantly feel like I'm battling between the better angels and the lesser angels in my own mind.
So this would take, hopefully, not an isolation for people who want to exercise their faith well and be in power. Because actually, if we believe that God calls people to different positions, He may very well call persons of faith to positions of power. And we know that He will equip those whom He calls. But you have to, it seems to me, use the community in order to keep your feet on the ground.
That's right. And so having a group of friends who can ask the hard questions, how are you treating your wife? How are you interacting with your kids? What are you doing with your finances? These are basic questions that we have to ask. And the leaders who were most impressive were people who found that they were in accountability in one way or another. Just a quick example, I interviewed Dennis Bakke, who at one time was the CEO of AES, the world's largest privately held energy company. And I said to him, how do you keep things real? And he said, my wife and I made a decision that we do not make any financial allocation over $10,000 without the support of a small group of friends who we ask questions. So he said, just last week, something broke with a pool that's in our backyard. It's going to cost $40,000 to fix. We're not going to fix it until this small group of friends tell us that it's okay. That kind of sense of accountability is rare, but it actually helps people tremendously in navigating the opportunities and the perils that go with managing privileges.
So what have you learned specifically that was a surprise to you during these interviews?
I think that I was struck by how big a toll it can take on family life if you don't set your own limits. That the idea of sort of creating some kind of a Sabbath in your own life is not about, do you go to church or not, but it's actually sort of saying, I'm human and I have limits and I need to bridle that ambition, and creating ways in which you can actually pull back the reins so that you can nurture those family relationships. They're the ones that will last the longest and the most important, but they're also the ones that are most fragile as you move up into powerful positions.
Because you don't want regrets.
Don't want regrets.
My guest today has been Michael Lindsay of Rice University's Department of Sociology in their Center on Race, Religion, and Urban Life. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.